And we are live. Yes. Welcome, everyone. Come on in. Come on in for an amazing edition of Tuesday Talk. We are live 9 p.m. GMT. Who in the chat knows what that stands for? Greenwich Mean Time. Yes, 3 p.m. Eastern Time and wherever else you are. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Tuesday Talk. We have an amazing guest today. An amazing guest, an internationally known and recognized and absolutely well respected author and Black historian, Mr. Robin Walker. His
Greetings, greetings.
Greetings. How are you?
I'm having a good time.
Good.
Yeah, life is good.
Life is good. It definitely is perspective and how you see it. I hate to be cliche. How is the weather where you are?
Cold, dull, and miserable. In other words, a typical London day.
A typical London day. Well, you have a little snippet of America right now on the East Coast and all this. So we're just going to give you some of the sunshine. We only have like 2 minutes left of it, but we're going to give it all to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Awesome. So for those of you who do not know who Mr. Robin Walker is, you are in for a treat. This man is brilliant, and he has given us so much information and tools that we can use to help us live a more African-centered life. Okay. So as we have our conversation, remember, I told you Tuesday Talk is about learning and having the tools that you need to live the life that you want. So watch it and then rewatch it and take your notes and make sure that you're learning along the way. So, Mr. Walker, can you please tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you were born, what influences you had early on in your childhood, and how Black history was introduced to you?
I was born in London in 1967. Um, the first 4 years of my life were in London, but then my parents wanted to return to Jamaica. So I spent 2 years living in Jamaica. Their marriage fell apart, and the result was they brought me back to England. So from the age of 6, I was back in England, and my growing up was done in Milton Keynes. But my adult education, when I became an adult, I went to university in London, and I've been back in London ever since. Like most people of my generation, I didn't think there was any such thing as Black history or African history. The only sense of Black history that we had was, of course, the TV series Roots. And what that tended to show was the only history there was slavery and what came after slavery. So I had no real sense of Black history or African heritage. But I promised myself that when I graduated from university, I would read the book, Chancellor Williams's book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. And I read that book in 1990. I didn't believe a word of it, but I did have a philosophy background. Philosophy was my second subject at university. So I learned how to check an argument. And Chancellor Williams's book passed the test. And I've since read it 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened in 1990, later on, a girlfriend of mine suggested that there's this man called Dr. Femi Biko. He teaches Black history and African heritage. Perhaps we should all study with him. And I did that. And Femi introduced me to people like Professor John Jackson, Introduction to African Civilization, Man, God and Civilization. And other people introduced me to people like Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan, and then Professor Jacob Carruthers, and then Professor Sheikh Anta Diop. And I've just been reading ever since. But before 1990, I had no knowledge of Black history at all, because I didn't even think there was such a subject.
Wow, that is amazing to have written the books and articles and things that you've written, to have had such a like a very definitive date as to when this door, kind of opened up for you, is amazing. Can you tell me some of the things that you read that stuck with you? And I understand the proofing component to what kind of led you into Black history and reading and continuing, because once that first book passed your test of scrutiny, which we should all do, then you realized, hey, there are other books out here and other people out here that I should be reading to learn about my history. After you read that book, were you thinking, you know what, I do have some history, let me go seek it? Was there kind of a light bulb moment after you read the first book?
What happened next was, when I came across Yusuf Ben Yokanan's books, I was really impressed, because he writes in a very confrontational style. He will present some data and then tell the readers, if you don't believe any of this, check out this reference, this reference, this reference, this reference, this reference. I've never seen anyone do that before. I didn't know that that is how history is written. I didn't know that with history, every point that you make, you have to be able to prove. You've got to remember, I don't have any history background. My background's economics. My background is music. So I didn't know that that's how it was done. And Ben Yokanan made it clear that that's how it's done. So Ben Yokanan, very, very impressed with Ben Yokanan. And then it was after that, then it was the other people, Jacob Carruthers, John Jackson, etc., etc., etc. Light bulb moments were when I found out that the central thesis of Chancellor Williams's book was actually wrong. Yeah, I said it. The central thesis was wrong. The evidence wasn't all destroyed. Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. And that was the biggest shock of them all. I found out that a lot of the ancient and medieval monuments that Chancellor hints were all destroyed. Many of them are actually still standing. So a lot of people have this idea that ancient Egypt is the only place in Africa where there's ancient evidence. And the impression given by a lot of scholars, no disrespect, but a lot of African American scholars, is that outside of Egypt, everything else has been destroyed. And then you find out that the city of Timbuktu, for example, is still standing, with its 14th century heritage is still there. The University Mosque of Sankore is still standing. The oratory of Sidi Yahya is still standing. The Jingorabira Mosque, built by Mansa Musa I, is still standing. You then find out that the palaces in Hausaland, built during the time of Mohammed Rumfa in the late 15th century, that's still there. The Daura Palace is still there. The Katsina University building is still there. Then in some other parts of Africa that Chancellor didn't venture into, like Ethiopia, you've got obelisks in one city, you've got underground churches in another, you've got mosques in another, you've got fairy tale castles in another. Stuff is still standing. So what it was what Professor Williams should have said is the attempted destruction of Black civilization, not the destruction. Do you see the difference?
Absolutely, absolutely. That
And
was
same
great.
thing. Professor Williams says in that the Timbuktu manuscripts were all destroyed in 1590. He says 1591. Everybody else says 1594. We've since found out that 700,000 of those manuscripts are actually still here.
That's amazing. So when you hear the list of some of the stuff that Mr. Walker mentioned is in his book, When We Ruled, and and it goes more into depth in the book that we're going to discuss later. There's kind of a little bit of an insert right there. And so the list of what he just gave you was a verbal list of proof and evidence of our civilizations that are still standing, to prove that thousands of years ago we had already achieved a certain level of intelligence, decorum, university in the sense of learning and coming together to learn, and that the evidence of that level of progression of our civilization existed way back then. So that lends to the, that undergirds and explains how we are as ancient as we are as African people, and how that traverses the entire continent. I remember learning it. So a little bit about my background is I, I knew Santa Claus was not real. Jesus was black, and the first people on the planet were African people. And I had, my parents gave me as much African and black history that they knew. And so in school learning certain things, I questioned it. Like I remember being in my freshman class and we had heritage. And I was like, how is this heritage when we're not talking about African people? And then I'm like, oh, well, they just mean they must mean white heritage. And so along the way, I kind of made some of those fixes. So if you were taught that our history begins with slavery, or the wordplay is slaves come from Africa, like you go to the grocery store to buy groceries, you go to a car lot to buy a car, you go to a hair care supply store to buy hair care supplies. So when you hear slaves come from Africa, it makes it sound like Africa is like the store for slaves, and like that's all Africa made. And so when you frame it with that word, with that wording, and then you don't give any history uh, to precede that, that it frames your mind into thinking that, hey, we just appear as slaves and we have no history. And so then when you have someone like what Mr. Walker just listed, all of the evidence and proof of the ancient civilizations that we had, means that we don't come from enslaved people, that unfortunately that's a part of a much greater longer history that far extends way back beyond what is always in the forefront of how we're all portrayed. Okay, so like Mr. Walker named a lot of places that we should all research, learn, and know about. Just because he rattled it off of his head that fast doesn't mean that it's not important. It's important because it gives you the backstory to us. So I hope that you kind of, get a little bit of that, with what he was just saying. I do want to go a little bit into the long chronology and the short chronology, and if you can kind of give some contemporary history as well. On this platform, we spend a lot of time talking about Kemetic history, or ancient Kemetic history, which is very important. That civilization is very important. But just like you said, there were other civilizations that were happening at or around that time. If you could kind of give us the long and the short chronology, and also give us contemporaneous history with people from that time.
Okay, very simply, the question is, how old is ancient Egyptian history, ancient Kemetic history? What's the starting point? Well, if you go online or you pick up a mainstream history book, the impression would be given that Egypt's very first pharaoh, the very first pharaoh of the very first dynasty, is Pharaoh. Sometimes his name is given as Menes, sometimes it's given as Name, and he is said to have ruled 3,100 years BC. And that's the generally accepted perspective. The problem with that generally accepted perspective is that it was completely fabricated and has absolutely no documentary evidence to support it.
Wow.
The actual history of Egypt was compiled by an ancient Egyptian historian called Manetho. Some people call him Me-Entehuti. And he was commissioned during the Greek period to write a history of Egypt. And his book hasn't survived. What we have is what later scholars quote him as saying. And there
Okay.
are two such scholars. One of them is Bishop Eusebius, who's a Christian scholar, and another scholar is Julius Africanus. And Julius Africanus seems to have had the most complete account of what Manetho says. And from Julius Africanus, we can reconstruct most of Manetho's King's List. And if you then go through that Manetho's King's List and start counting backwards, the impression that you would get is the very first king of the very first dynasty is 5717 BC, which is 2,500 years later, earlier than the made up 3100 BC chronology, which is the one that you see all over the internet and so on and so forth. Now, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right.
That's right. That's right.
And what happens is because the only scholars that have investigated the chronology properly from our perspective is Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan, who has a first dynasty date of 5701 BC, and he's getting that from a scholar called Joseph Hekakian Bey. And the other one is John Jackson, who is coming with 5776 BC, and he's getting that from Duncan McNaughton. So what I did was I checked the Joseph Hekakian Bey chronology, and I checked the Duncan McNaughton chronology, and I found that what they are saying is much, much closer to the truth than the made-up 3100 BC nonsense, which is in all the history books and so on and so forth. So what I did was look at what are the fixed points in the history, and what is the evidence for those fixed points. And then what I did essentially was correct Manetho, correct Me Entehuti. And it's not a difficult correction. Sometimes he missed a king out, so I put him in. Sometimes he put some people in that we can't substantiate, so I took them out. And just by dotting I's and crossing T's, I came to the conclusion that the very first king of the very first dynasty, Menes or Name, was 5660 BC, which is close to the 5717 given by Julius Africanus, close to the 5701 given by Joseph Hekakian Bey and used by Yusuf Ben Yochanan, and close to the 5776 BC used by John Jackson, but he's actually getting it from Duncan McNaughton. So what I did was I also then found out, well, what is the evidence on which the whole chronology is based on? And so I checked things like the Turin Papyrus. I can't read ancient Egyptian, but I can count in it. So if you know how long a particular person's supposed to reign, you can work out, oh, that's him or that's her. And I was able to do that, compare it with the other fixed points in Egyptian history. And the most important thing was, I think are you aware of the redating of the Sphinx by Professor Robert Schoch? Professor Schoch. Okay, the Sphinx is not 2500 BC or 2600 BC, which is part of the lying propaganda that makes Dynasty 4 2500, 2600 BC, and therefore Dynasty 1 3100 BC. The Sphinx is actually 5000 BC, and that was established by Professor Robert Schoch of the University of Boston, who noticed that the Sphinx has rainwear in a country where it doesn't rain. And therefore, Egypt must have rained at some point, and the latest geological period where it could have rained was 5000 BC, and therefore the latest possible date for the building of the Sphinx is 5000 BC. Now, on my chronology, the fourth dynasty, the time period of Pharaoh Khafra, the builder of the Sphinx, is 4800 BC, which is close to Robert Schoch's 5000 BC. Do you see?
Yes.
And that means then the long chronology is correct. And so the short chronology, it may be popular, but, you know, at one time, Donald Trump was popular. It is what it is.
It is what it is. Thank you. So what Mr. Walker just did was basically like when you are putting your sheets on the bed and you shake them, and then you smooth it out, and then you see what you have in terms of where you have to begin to fold it under the mattress. That's what he just did. By correcting dates based upon empirical evidence, based upon evidence, we can give the a more accurate date as to when things happen. And so you've got a longer chronology, meaning we go back even farther than what people typically say. And what he was saying, just because something is popular doesn't make it correct. Can you talk a little bit about Sumer and where Sumer fits into all of this and the level of their development of their civilization around the same time?
Yeah, ancient Sumer was in fact a largely Negro civilization, even though on the modern map it's Iraq. Now that blows people's minds, but we weren't just in ancient Egypt.
That's right.
The Middle East during this time period was Negro as well. And the descendants of those Sumerians, they're still around today in modern Iraq. There's a population in modern Iraq known as the Marsh Arabs.
Mm.
And the Marsh Arabs to this day are black. And they are the descendants of the Sumerians. All right, now, what dating do we have for the Sumerians? I mentioned a scholar called Duncan McNaughton. And Duncan McNaughton is the person that wrote the book, A Scheme of Egyptian Chronology, where he poses the date 5776 for Egypt's very first king, Pharaoh Menes or Pharaoh Name. That same Duncan McNaughton, the same guy, wrote a book on Babylonian chronology. And that book was published in 1929. And that book is called A Scheme of Babylonian Chronology, published by Duncan McNaughton. Excuse me, I'm wrong. 1930s when it was published. And I have the book. And his very first kings of the Middle East, Sumer, his very first kings is 3189 BC. And 3189 BC is 2,500 years after the very first kings of Egypt. So when the ancient Egyptians were doing their thing, the Sumerians were in prehistory. They were not dealing with history yet. And the time period where the Sumerians are dealing with history is the same time period that the ancient Egyptians were dealing with the Middle Kingdom. So ancient Sumer is the same time period as Middle Kingdom Egypt, i.e. 11th, 12th dynasty Egypt.
Can you explain what prehistory means?
Before there's governments. Does that make sense? All right, so what it is then, if we go back before Pharaoh Name in Egypt, there's no government. Egypt, there's people living there, but they haven't established a government yet. They haven't established kings yet. They haven't established laws yet. And the most important thing that makes up history is they don't have writing yet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so anything before that period is prehistory. So the Sumerians, they get their act together 3189 BC, according to Duncan McNaughton. So before 3189 BC, they are in prehistory. And before 5776 BC, according to Duncan McNaughton, the ancient Egyptians are in prehistory.
Okay. So basically prehistory is before people really kind of come together as a community and set up some structure and record who they are and what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. So, when we had spoken before, we talked a little bit about the Egyptians being the kind of little bit more recent ancestors to the West Africans. Can you go into a little bit of that and your opinion on, Egypt fell and migrated west and, settled in West Africa. Can you go into some of that for us, please?
Honest opinion, I don't believe that happened.
Right.
Yeah. I am very, very much guided by my colleague and co-writer. If those of you that have got the book When We Ruled, it's co-written by a Zimbabwean scholar called Farirei Supia. And he has researched the linguistics of it. And here's the thing. We can definitely trace from ancient Egypt to East African culture. So there are people in East Africa who you can clearly draw a connection between the ancient Egyptians and them. With West Africa, it's much harder to do, because if the ancient Egyptians are the direct ancestors of West Africans, we have to ask the obvious question, why aren't the West Africans speaking Coptic, which is what the West Africans should be speaking? Does that make sense? We can't explain that. So Fari Supia's position, and this is the position that, because he's the person that did that research, I'm of the opinion that yes, the ancient Egyptians were Black people. Yes, they were ancestors in the broadest sense of the term, but they are not the lineal ancestors of West Africans. They're lineal ancestors of other groups of Black people in Africa. All right, so are there any West Africans speaking anything like ancient Egyptian? Yes, the Hausas. You can link Hausa, you can link Cushitic, which is Somali, you can link Berber, which is the language of the desert Berbers. It's called Tamashek. You can link ancient Egyptian into one language family. So Hausa, spoken by the northern Nigerians, that is indeed related to ancient Egyptian. But the other populations that people think of as being descended from the ancient Egyptians, such as the Yoruba, the language is just too different. And the percentage of ancient Egyptian words that should be in Yoruba, they're just not there. Do you see? So in my opinion, the ancient Egyptians should be seen as ancestors in the general sense, but not in the specific sense of being the ancestors of people from West Africa.
So I smiled when he said Hausa land, because my grandmother took the test for the maternal lineage to see where the original African woman came from, and it was Hausa land. And so that's super exciting to hear that, and to hear that from you. So that was pretty awesome for me personally. And so once again, we have empirical evidence that can track migration, and that can track how culture moves from one place, to the next. Does that mean that no ancient Kemites went west? Probably not. But it means that the majority of them, the culture, the people, there's not as much proof, especially linguistically, as would need to prove that. So speaking of East Africa, can you because so some books will say, when they draw the map of Ethiopia, it would include what we would call Egypt, and then some books have Egypt closer to, or Kemet closer to how Egypt is drawn today. Can you explain the similarities between ancient Kemites and Ethiopians, the origins, and what is similar and what is slightly just a little bit of a variation of brothers and sisters?
When the books talk about ancient Ethiopia, they don't mean the modern country calling itself Ethiopia. They mean the modern country calling itself Sudan. So the ancient Ethiopia. So when the Greeks talk about Zeus coming to earth to be honored by the blameless Ethiopians, they don't mean the country called Ethiopia today. They mean the country called Sudan today. Now, the country called Sudan today, in the ancient world, it was the kingdom of Tarseti. Later on, that same region became the kingdom and later empire of Kush. Later on, that same region became the three Christian kingdoms of Nobadia, Makuria, and Alwa. And so that region has got a huge amount of history. Now, if we look at the civilization of Tarseti, Tarseti has kings 200 to 300 years before the ancient Egyptian first pharaoh. The first pharaoh is, as we've said, is Menes. Some people call him Name. And 9 to 11 pharaohs ruled in the Nubian kingdom of Tarseti before him. And 5,000 artifacts were discovered at a series of royal tombs in Nubia. And those 5,000 artifacts show that the early Nubians were worshipping the deity Osiris or Osar, whatever you want to call it. And so Osar is a deity that has its origins in Nubia. There's an artifact called the crystal incense burner, which has got an image of a pharaoh on it, and the pharaoh is wearing the white crown of what people call the white crown of Upper Egypt. It wasn't Upper Egypt, it was the white crown of Nubia. That if you didn't know that Nubia existed before Egypt, you wouldn't know that the white crown was originally the white crown of Nubia, not Upper Egypt. The rosette, the symbol of kingship, is also depicted on that same crystal incense burner. And so a lot of things that we thought of as ancient Egyptian actually had its origins in the Nubian kingdom of Tarseti. Then you have the legendary British scholar, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, who wrote a series of books on ancient Egyptian religion, where he traces the Egyptian deity Bes to lands far to the south of Egypt. He traces the ancient Egyptian deity Amen to Kush. He traces the deity Shu. He says that that is a Nubian deity. Horus is a Nubian deity. Set is a Nubian deity. And therefore, a lot of the deities that the ancient Egyptians adored don't actually come from Egypt. They actually come from Nubia. And so they became a part of Egyptian religion, but that's not where those deities originated. And then my colleague Faris Supia has shown that the Book of the Dead, excuse me, was it the Book of the Dead or the coffin text? One of them, they mention a lake of fire as one of the places being depicted. And he's found that that's actually in Central Africa. There are the Great Lakes region. One of them you could reasonably call a lake of fire. Do you see? So a lot of the Book of the Dead, the places being depicted in it are Central African topography.
Interesting. So in ancient, so some of the stories that Egyptians had, or ancient Kemites had, they acknowledged the fact that their ancestors came from the geographical south, which would include Sudan, which would also include what we would call South Africa today, with the Sankoy people. Can you explain or show some kind of lineage of northern migration with linguistics and culture, starting with the Sankoy people and up through Tassetis, the Sudan, and Egypt or Kemet?
Same thing. I can't prove that. This is what I can prove. The sycamore tree, which is associated with the deity Hathor, or Heteru, that is not native to Egypt. That actually comes from Central Africa. And as migrants moved north, they were able to get that tree to grow in further northern climates before it became an Egyptian tree. Do you see? So that's one that we can definitely trace from Central Africa, the sycamore tree. But as far as connecting ancient Egypt to the San and other Southern African populations, there may be a connection, but I can't prove what that connection is. Now, this is what white scholars say. White scholars say that the population of ancient Egypt, particularly in the north, were not your typical Negroes. They were your typical Bushmen. And to give you an example, during the 1970, was it 1971 or 1974, when Sheikh Anta Diop and Teofilo Benga took on those 18 fools at the Cairo Symposium. You know about that? When it was established that the ancient Egyptians really were Africans, one of the fools said, no, they were not Africans, they were Bushmen. And it was like, dude, you've just lost your argument. So that's what some white scholars say. So that might be where the connection between the San and the Egyptians, that may be where some scholars are getting it from. But from my perspective, I can't prove that yet. So I don't go there yet.
So, knowing that you can't prove it, can I ask you, do you believe it?
Don't know.
Okay.
My thing is the ancient Egyptians were Africans, but whether it was Group A Africans or Group B Africans or Group C, whatever, I'm easy. You know? Yeah.
Right. Me personally, I think that because so much of our history has been hidden from us and lied to us on purpose, the discovery of it is something that is enjoyable because,
Absolutely.
yeah. And if you really want to know who you are, you have to know where you came from. So enjoying this process at this time in our lives is something that I think people can look at it as a huge undertaking, which it is, but just kind of dive into it in a way that's exciting. Because when we hear new information, other stuff is dispelled. We learn new languages, just learn new information. To me, it's just like a bevy of information that can be kind of fun. So I really do, kind of appreciate the process of understanding who we are in learning new things about ourselves. You know what I'm saying? That's one of the reasons why I started Tuesday Talk, so that people can come on and get information and go back, look it over. Mr. Walker has listed so many key points and places and dates and people and things like that you could, once again, I always encourage my Tuesday Talk audience to rewatch it and to take notes on what they've, learned, excuse me, from that. So I also want to talk a little bit about the Songhai people. And I know that was mentioned in your book, When We Ruled. We're going to get to When We Ruled in a few, but in that progression of what we discussed of the different groups, where does the Songhai people fit? Where do they fit?
Okay. I've actually written a whole book on the Songhai Empire called Everyday Life in an Early West African Kingdom. Songhai history is 61 kings, and the very first of them ruled in 690 AD. And they belong to three dynasties, the Zua dynasty, the Sunni dynasty, and the Askir dynasty. Some of the people watching may know of Askir Muhammad the Great.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, what's interesting about the Songhai history is it's well documented. So we do have two Timbuktu chronicles that have come down to us intact. There was a chronicle written by a Timbuktu professor called Mahmoud Kati, and his chronicle is called the Tariq el-Fatash, which means Chronicle for the Seeker of Truth. And another chronicle is called the Tariq es-Sudan, written by Professor Abdurrahman el-Sadi, who is another Timbuktu professor. We also have an eyewitness who's an outsider coming to visit, Leo Africanus. He visits Songhai, and he visits some of the cities and gives us a visitor's perspective. And we have an English scholar called Richard Jobson, who visits the Gambia, which was an outpost of Songhai. And he visited it in 1620, 21, 22, something like that. And his book is called The Golden Trade. And so by using those four sources and using other sources from, Moorish chroniclers and so on and so forth, me and my team, we were able to write quite possibly the most detailed account of the Songhai Empire in print. So when it comes to even things like the structure of the society, the industries, the music, the food, we were able to reconstruct that.
So
go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say for my Tuesday Talk team to put everyday life in an early West African kingdom in the chat, so people have access to that book. We're going to do a lot of that at the end, but Mr. Walker just let us know that he and his team wrote basically the most comprehensive book and information on the Songhai people. And so when and kind of chipping away at learning about our history, we have to start with good references and good texts. So put that in the chat, guys, and I'm gonna put it up for everyone to see. So go ahead with what you were saying.
No, all I was saying was in calling the book Everyday Life in an Early West African Empire, we really are giving an everyday life. So if you went to school, what would that look like? If you were working, what did that look like? If you were enslaved, yes, Songhai had slaves. What did that look like? But you see, when the people hear the word slaves, they think, oh, the same as what Europeans did to us in the Americas. Not necessarily. There's an account of a Songhai slave visiting Mecca without his enslaver's permission and coming back. And no, he wasn't punished. Do you see? You get a very, very rich sense of the kind of thinking and intellectualism of the people of West Africa. And it's a kind of thing that most people have never come across before. So some of the things that people said to each other, some of the attitudes, and essentially it's a very, very rich history.
That sounds really interesting to know such detail. How did you guys find information on just like two people having a conversation, living their everyday life?
A lot of it appears in the chronicles. So the Tariq el-Fatash. One of the things that upset one of the Askias, there's an Askia called Askia Dawood, and he's the middle of the 16th century. And what happened was an enslaved person, his name was Misikwala, he did an act of charity where he gave away wealth to people even poorer than himself. And word reached Askia Dawood that happened, and he was in consternation. How is this enslaved person giving away wealth and I haven't done anything? And so his advisors then come with a plan why the Askia should be giving away even more wealth. And they try to work the plan. And in the account given by the Tariq el-Fatash, it's about 11 pages of the consternation this enslaved person giving away wealth caused Askia Dawood. And his advisors come with a situation of how they can give away more. And one of his advisors says, and that is the difference between an elephant and a mouse, meaning the Askia is the elephant, the enslaved person is the mouse. Now, the idea that the emperor should be upset that somebody gave away more than he did. Now, doesn't that paint an interesting picture?
Slightly.
Yeah. You then read about Professor Ahmed Baba, one of the Timbuktu professors. he was captured and enslaved by the Moroccans. And the thing that upset him most was he lost his 1,600 books.
Mm-hmm.
1,600 books. Is that the kind of libraries that people had? Again, these are the kind of things that come out. And the other thing too is the monuments from the time period. I mentioned some of them, the Timbuktu monuments, the Genet monuments, the Gao monuments. Some of these buildings are still standing. So contrary to Professor Chancellor Williams, they weren't all destroyed. But what it is that if you don't know that, you don't know that.
Right. And that, and that is the process of learning. It's you have to go search and find, and then you get, information A, and this is accurate until information B comes along, which modifies, right, or might disregard information A. And whomever presented that wasn't trying to be dishonest. It's just that's what we had, at that particular time. So I also wanted to ask you about the farewell sermon by the Prophet Muhammad. Can you explain a little bit about that and how, that was influential?
I didn't. Well, I have written about it, but I think you think I wrote a book on it. I didn't. I wrote one chapter on it. Let me explain. The farewell sermon, according to the way it's quoted, I've heard Muslims quote it. There's a passage where it says, the Arab is not superior to the non-Arab, nor is the white man superior to the black. And two scholars doubt that the Prophet said that. Now, the significance of it is that if that's the way around, the Arab is not superior to the non-Arab, nor is the white man superior to the black. It gives the impression that the Prophet was white and he was talking to white people. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what color the Prophet was, and we don't know if he was talking to white people. And that would be your trump card to say he was white, he was talking to white people. But since I've come across two sources that say that is not in the original farewell sermon, then we can't draw the conclusion that it was a white prophet talking to a white audience. So I'm not saying, therefore, the Prophet of Islam was black. I'm raising the question that he wasn't white. And that being the trump card that people will use, that trump card is not actually authentic to the speech, according to the two sources that I came across.
Okay. So, excuse me. So I see that you had written a series of reports on just different aspects of Black living, like the Black Community Report, the Black Child Report, Classical Splendor, Roots in Black History, and People Science and Intelligence Unit. That is just a few, that I came across, and they were all before when we ruled. Can you tell us after, because it sounds like, you read this book and it opened up the door to not only Black history, but how to prove it and disprove it, and the fact that that's necessary. Then you've got this bevy of information, you're working with people. What was your precipice to say, hey, you know what? I know a few things. I'm going to write a book and I'm going to call it When We Ruled. How did that process happen?
Okay, the People Science Intelligence Unit was a business that was run by one of my colleagues. Mm-hmm. And because my background is economics and my second study was philosophy, he wanted someone who knows about economics and knows about statistics to interpret the findings. So essentially, the Black Community Report, the Black Child Report, the Asian Community Report, those were statistical papers that was done on the lifestyles, the spending habits, the schooling, the wealth of the Black community in Britain and the Asian community in Britain. The term Asian in Britain means people from India and surrounding countries. It doesn't mean China and surrounding countries. Do you see? Mm-hmm. And what it meant is that we were, for that time period, the authorities on Black Britain and Asian Britain, because we were the only people with that statistical data. Okay. And so we were able to talk about the schooling, what people, how people spent their money, their educational attainments. We were able to give a very, very full picture, and make that available to libraries that wanted that information, government bodies that wanted that information, and companies interested in marketing to the Black community and to the Asian community. And one of our findings, which I'm very, very proud of because we spotted it before anybody else, is we found that there was an inverse relationship between Black people in Britain getting educated and Black people in Britain getting employed. Inverse relationship. As people got educated, their chances of getting a job went down, not up.
Okay.
Down, not up. And what that showed then is proof that employers were discriminating against Black people who were educated.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone thought before that, no. The more educated you get, your employment chances go up. Well, we were the first people to show that statistically that's not true. It actually goes down. All right. Now, after that, I wrote my first African history book, Classical Splendor, Roots of Black History. And I think that book came out in 1999. Mm-hmm. And in every way, it's the precursor to When We Ruled. So if you take that book and fatten it up, you get When We Ruled.
Okay, good.
Okay, so When We Ruled, Classical Splendor came out in 1999. When We Ruled came out in 2006. Mm-hmm. And why When We Ruled was written is nobody took Classical Splendor seriously. Nobody. So what I wanted to do was to write a book that was so big, so thick, that people couldn't ignore it. Right. And that was the whole point of writing When We Ruled. It was going to be called When We Were Kings, but my publisher, who's a Black politician called Patrick Vernon, he suggested, can you make the title gender neutral? So if you take When We Were Kings and gender neutral it became When We Ruled.
Oh, okay, great. Now, I know that When We Ruled has a foreword by Runoko Rashidi, the late great Runoko Rashidi. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Runoko and perhaps his influence on the book?
Rashidi, he did a lot of work in London, and we hosted him in London where he gave lectures, he gave presentations, and he did tours of the British Museum. So we spent a lot of time with Rashidi, so we've got big love for Rashidi. And the result was, we talked a lot and that kind of thing. And so when I sent the book to Black Classic Press to see if they wanted to publish an American version of it, they suggested, I suggested, can you get Yusuf Ben Yochanan to write the foreword? And they said, no, he's too old. He's not in a good place. And they suggested, well, Rashidi, yeah, okay, can we get Rashidi to write the foreword? And so the American edition does have the Rashidi foreword. So I'm very, very chuffed about that, to be honest. Now, the influence of Rashidi, two of the chapters, is it 2 chapters, 3 chapters? I can't even remember, deals with African civilizations in Asia. So, and Rashidi is the pioneer. That's his domain. So the Sumerians, the Elamites is where Iran is today. The Indus Valley civilization is where Pakistan and Western India is today. The Arabia Felix civilization is where Yemen is today. And Rashidi is the pioneer. So he's the man, he's the person that made that happen. So my research is following his research in that area.
Awesome. Yes. That's a nice little tribute to Runoko Rashidi. So I want to kind of wind down and wrap up with some of the things that you do or have done, do you still have Black history classes? Do you still tutor Black history? Is there some kind of way that people can continue to learn Black history through your services?
Yes, there is.
Mhm.
I have an online website called The Black Secret.
Mhm.
The website is www.theblacksecret.co.uk.
.uk. Okay.
And what that is, it's an online course and it's properly structured. I've been teaching Black history and African heritage for years. And then the idea is to put that content online. So the classes are filmed in a London classroom. And I'm teaching, and what I'm presenting, you've got my presentation on screen. So the images that I'm talking over, you can see them. The notes that I'm giving out, you can see that. So basically, you can teach yourself Black history and African heritage from this course.
Okay.
So we are inviting people to subscribe to our course. Normally, it's £35 per month. But because it's, we've just had Black History Month in Britain, so we've got a sale price, which is half that, £18 per calendar month. And we want people to subscribe and teach themselves the history and heritage. And it is a course, so it starts with, so we've got all the great civilizations in there: Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the Nigerian civilizations, Nok, Igbo, Yoruba, Benin, and Hausaland. You've got Kanem Bornu. You've got the medieval Nubian kingdoms of Makuria, Alwa, Nobadia. You've got Ethiopia. You've got the Swahili city-states. You've got Great Zimbabwe, Munumutapa. You've got Congo and Angola, Nzinga country. You've got human origins. You've got the ancient Egyptians broken down into the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, the Kushite period. Oh, by the way, did you know that the ancient Kushites, for a brief period, actually ruled Spain? And we've actually got this a Spanish document where you can actually see the name Taharqa coming up in the document. And this is a Spanish medieval scholar writing in medieval times, talking about how the Kushites conquered, his country. We've got Carthage, we've got the Sumerians, all that good stuff. And the most recent part of the course is we've got the last 500 years, which will include African-American civil rights, Black British civil rights, great Africans over the last 500 years, all that good stuff. So it's a very, very thorough course, and you're going to come out learning tons of Black history and African heritage.
Wow. The synopsis was a lot. You could just learn something from what you just said. So is it self-paced? You start and then you just work your way through it?
Yeah, so each class is about 1.5 to 2 hours. If you don't have 1.5 to 2 hours, you can watch it for 10 minutes, freeze. I'll come back to it tomorrow. If you want to watch at 3 o'clock in the morning, you want to fit half an hour in, freeze, come back to it when you've got some more time. Do you see? And then once you do each class, then there's an exam. You can test yourself.
Awesome.
And then we have systems and structures in place to mark what you've got and send it back. So you really can learn Black history and African heritage and really get up to speed. So it's not just Kemet and Kush. You really are going to get the full package. But Kemet is in there, Kush is in there. And the thing about the chronology of ancient Egypt and the detail of that chronology, we've got all of that in there. So if people want to know how the chronology was put together, that content is there.
So they don't call you the Black History Man for no reason. That is awesome. I'm taking that course and I'm going to encourage others to take that. So, there's a lot of comments in the chat. I'm going to just scroll through and see if we can get some questions answered. Kametia says, great to hear this brother's perspective. I appreciate the accurate breakdown of the history. And let's see. Just want to get questions. Kametia says, there is some evidence of ancient calendars in South Africa that predates those in Taseti. Mr. Walker, have you come across that?
Yeah, I have, but I don't believe it. I don't believe it. What it is, it's an article that came out called Adam's Calendar. And what was found was where modern Johannesburg was found stone ruins. And two reports came out, one claiming that those stone ruins go back 77,000 years. And then a second report said, no, that's wrong, 168,000 years. Now, here's the point. I'm not hating on those reports, because my thing is, if they can prove that we were building in stone in Southern Africa 168,000 years, I'm running with that. Huh. The problem is it was based on astronomical dating, and the astronomical dates don't stand up. That's what the problem is.
Right.
So the articles exist. They're there. The papers exist. The papers do say what I said they said, but it's purely that the astronomical dates don't stand up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there's no tangible proof that stands the test of time or scrutiny. So.
Yeah. So in other words, the people that are quoting it, they're not quoting it dishonestly. The papers do say that. It's just that I have to make sure that I'm happy that would stand up in court. And I think a court, a lawyer could tear that apart in court. So I can't use it yet.
I hear you on that. And we've got someone who says, "What? I just watched it. Robin Harper, definitely watching this from the beginning, as am I." And Robert James says, "It's a great course. Peace to Robin." And Shaka Ross.
Thanks.
Shaka Ross says, "I can personally couch for Robin Walker's Black Studies history courses. Get on it. You won't be disappointed." So we have Scribe Sanjeti, who teaches the Medu Neter. He is a member of the Temple of Anu. In regards to the chronology of dynastic period and the modern issues we have, are there any updates to the topic in the online course from the contents and When We Rule?
Some of When We Ruled is no longer where it's at. The chapter on human origins in When We Ruled is now old and outdated. New discoveries basically, and the new discoveries are in the online course. But I haven't had an opportunity to rewrite When We Ruled to change the data. Do you see? But yes. The online course is about as cutting edge as I'm aware of.
Guys, it's here. So many times people don't know where to start because they're so overwhelmed. Well, here it is, y'all. It's right here. And if you want it, go get it. Okay. So I'm going to end it with that. Well, actually, I'm going to say this with all of Mr. Walker's contact information, his website, his book, When We Ruled. I'm going to get this information from him and update it. So, Mr. Walker, what I do is after the show is over, wherever I advertised it, I update it and I put links to any contact information that you want, the public to have. So just hang back a little bit afterwards. I'll get that information from you and I'm going to update all of this information. Guys, don't tell Mr. Walker, but I want to have him back. And here's what we can do. People who are going to sign up for the course, we can take the course together-ish, right? At our own pace, but at the same time, read the book When We Ruled, have Mr. Walker back, and we can have more of a question and answer kind of a Tuesday talk, but only after you've patronized his business, taken his courses, and have better questions to ask because you've spent the time to learn about it. If you're interested in doing this, because I'm doing it, y'all, And I want other people to do it with us. It'll be fun. You can have them back, ask some dope questions. Follow me at Yoga Girl Sai on Instagram and mention Tuesday Talk with Robin Walker. I'll organize it and we can make this fun. It's going to be at your own pace, but we'll be doing it together. Mr. Walker, thank you so much. This was such an eye-opening Tuesday Talk. Your course is the answer to a lot of people's dreams, really and truly, of understanding who they are, but having it in some form of order, chronology, sequence. Everything's been proofed and with evidence so that we know that we have a good, solid source. This is something people can do as a family. You could take a year to do it. You all, your grandmama, the babies, everybody that can hear and speak and can repeat what you say can be a part of this process of learning who you are and make it something that is a lot of fun. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us for Tuesday Talk, and my Tuesday Talk team who's in the background, keeping everything rolling. And of course, our guest, Mr. Robin Walker. It was such a pleasure having you. And I look forward to having you back after we do have our little group and learn from your course. So thank you so much for being a part of Tuesday Talk this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you can kind of hang back, I'm going to, something is stuck on this end. Here we go. I'm going to end the broadcast and then we'll be able to get some of that information, even though I think my Tuesday Talk team probably got that. So this won't take that much time. Oh my goodness. My computer is, oh, here we go. My computer is stuck. Sorry about that. All righty. Thank you everyone for joining Tuesday Talk, and I will see you next week. End the broadcast. We're still live. I apologize for this.
That's okay.
Here we go.